ravaging the East since 1937 and Japan's invasion of China, reached Europe on the 1st of September 1939 with Germany's invasion of Poland. It became global on the 7th of December 1941 when Japanese aircraft attacked the American naval base at Pearl Harbor. It touched every continent and lasted for 6 years. It ended with a new weapon for a new age. This is the history of the greatest of all man-made events. These men are part of that history. They are eyewitnesses to the triumphs and tragedies of the war wherever it was fought. Their testimony is part of the story of how our world was made. By those who could pay and those who could no longer meet. The price of empire. In the last episode of The Price of Empire, with British and American forces crossing the Rhine with the Red Army surging over Germany's eastern border, the defeat of Adolf Hitler and the Third Reich is inevitable. In the final episode, peace in Asia will follow peace in Europe after the detonation of a terrible new weapon. On the 28th of March 1945, the Supreme Allied Commander General Dwight D. Eisenhower, acting on his own initiative, advised the Soviet leadership that his troops would be advancing on the line Erfurt-Leipzig-Dresden. He made it clear that Berlin was not his objective. Stalin, delighted, replied that he too regarded Berlin as of no consequence. Churchill was appalled. He argued that the post-war settlement demanded that the Allies meet the Russians as far east as possible. Churchill's influence, Britain's influence, was on the wane. On the 28th, 3 army groups began their move towards the line Erfurt, Leipzig, Dresden. The British 2nd moved from its bridgehead at Wessel. The US 1st and 3rd trapped the German 89th Corps around Gießen. Four days later, the US 9th linked with the 1st at Lippstadt. In a little over 3 weeks, they would make contact with the Red Army. On April the 15th, after the Ruhr pocket had been cut in two, Field Marshal Walter Model was invited to surrender. Model replied that he was bound by his oath to Adolf Hitler and a formal surrender was out of the question. Instead, he dissolved his army group. 325,000 German troops were taken prisoner. 20th of April, the propaganda ministry in Berlin publicly denounced Army Group B as traitors. Model, who knew that the Soviets had indicted him for war crimes, shot himself in the head. Also in April, Nuremberg, so symbolic of Nazism, fell to General Patch's 7th US Army and American forces crossed the Danube. On the 25th, American and Soviet troops made contact. On the same day, the Red Army completed its encirclement of Berlin. Hitler declared that Berlin was to be a fortress. Defensive preparations were made in depth, but resources were far from elite. The 12th Army, west of the city, comprised 12 divisions that were a grab bag of raw recruits, misfits, leftovers and veterans. Von Manteuffel's 3rd Panzer Army north of the city comprised 9 divisions, none of which was panzer. The total deployed in defence of the capital was some 50 in different divisions. Coming towards them were almost 200 divisions of the Red Army. And as they came on, they scorched the earth. Everywhere that men make war, there is a tragic toll of brutalized, raped and murdered women. Not even the most inspired apologist can suggest that these victims were paying for crimes they had committed. Germany maintained 500 military brothels. As the Red Army surged into Berlin, it is estimated that 80,000 survived rape and 10,000 rape victims died, many by suicide. The figures are, predictably, disputed. The Soviet offensive was designed to ensure the fall of Berlin no later than May Day, May the 1st. Soviet forces began to move on April the 12th. On the 15th, Hitler issued a special order of the day. For the last time, it said, our deadly enemies, the Jewish Bolsheviks, have launched their massive forces to the attack. Hitler's order said that if every soldier did his duty, the last assault of Asia will crumple and Europe will never be Russian. $8,983 Soviet guns opened up. And more than 6 million men and women of the Red Army began to move. Zhukov's 1st Belarusian Front in the center, Konev 1st Ukrainian Front to his south, Rokossovsky 2nd Belarusian to his north, raced each other for the prize. Zhukov's offensive began when 140 searchlights operated by female soldiers were turned on in the eyes of the enemy. But the front line was found to be mostly deserted. In the city, up to 10,000 Germans were hanged for defeatism, many from lampposts. April the 20th was Hitler's 56th birthday. He decorated some members of the Hitler Youth for bravery, then went into the Führer bunker 16.5 meters below the Chancellery Garden for the last time.
Ехал в Берлин. Ну, в Берлине воевали сложно было, конечно. Мы прорывались к Рейхстагу, помогали пехоте туда продвигаться, пробивались, и везде это Нас тоже много подожгли, наших машин много. Я как-то остался, ничего. Немного было, там в ногу ранение у меня. Это такое легкое ранение. А так, вот вроде все у меня было нормально. После, значит, ну что, Берлин взяли, и война закончилась.
Now at last, after all the ghastly years of toil, blood, tears and sweat, the climax of total German defeat is reached with the death of Berlin.
On the 28th, Hitler learned that Heinrich Himmler had been behind the opening of armistice negotiations in Italy. Reichsmarshal Goering, who had slipped away south, signalled Hitler that since the Führer was trapped in Berlin, perhaps he should take control of the German state. Hitler ordered both Goering and Himmler stripped of their rank and arrested. He also ordered SS Obergruppenführer Hermann Fegelein shot, which he was, for attempting to slip out of Berlin in civilian clothes. He then married Fegelein's sister-in-law, Eva Braun, and drew up his last will and political testament in which he explained that I desire to share the fate that millions of others have taken upon themselves, in that I shall remain in this city. Furthermore, I do not want to fall into the hands of enemies who, for the delectation of the hate-riddled masses, require a new spectacle promoted by the Jews. On April 30th, after first successfully testing the poison on his beloved dog Blondie, Hitler and his new bride bit down on cyanide capsules, at which point Hitler, to be certain, shot himself in the temple. The Red Army was 200 meters away. The German wireless broadcasts serious, important news, said the announcer, and with Bruckner's Seventh playing as it had with the announcement of the fall of Stalingrad, the solemn voice continued. It is reported from the Führer's headquarters that our Führer, Adolf Hitler, fighting to the last breath against Bolshevism, fell for Germany this afternoon in his operational headquarters. Mrs. Goebbels murdered her 6 children, then she and her husband committed suicide. The next day the Reichstag fell and the red flag was famously hoisted on its roof.
Месте Бухрозенталь, там Берлина, нас повернули строго на юг, на Рейхстаг. Ну, было просто, значит, везут на повозке солдат, это пожилой такой с усами. Кого везешь, солдат? Геббельса. Мы все ха-ха-ха. Думаешь, шутит? А на завтра в газетах узнаем, действительно, это Геббельса везли.
General Helmut Wiedling, commanding the military garrison, surrendered the city. The battle for the capital had cost more than 300,000 Soviet casualties. Perhaps a similar number of German casualties and, in addition, 480,000 German prisoners who had failed in their attempt to break out west to surrender to the American, British and French forces from whom they expected kinder treatment.
Дальше картинка сразу. Берлин преобразился. Покрылся белым цветом. Из окон, балконов, где только можно, белые полотнища. простыни, наволочки, что угодно белое было, вывешивали. Берлинское население, не подтверждало, а само капитулировало, сообщало о своей безоговорочной капитуляции.
Мы с радостью узнали 2 мая, что пал Берлин. Радость была огромная. И даже радость была больше, чем когда узнали о победе. И это вроде какой-то меньший эффект был.
Немцы в этом время созрели и физически, и морально к капитуляции. Вот это, значит, белые флаги и вот эта колонна бесконечная.
Members of the Grand Alliance were by now making contact all along the front. Montgomery's forces met Rokossovsky's on the line Wismar-Wittenberg, and on May the 4th, Montgomery received the unconditional surrender of all German forces in northwest Germany, Denmark and the Netherlands.
Значит, в казарме команда «Подъем». Но мы уже привыкли. Подъем, тревога, в ружье. Выходи строиться. Все ясно. А тут подъем, никакой тревоги, никакого в ружье, ничего нет. Все встали, смотрят друг на друга. Что ж делать? Зачем подняли-то? Неясно. Потом посмотрели на улицу, а там мы в городке в таком жили, а там уже солдат до полна. Орут, кричат, обнимаются. Что такое? Войны конец, победа настала. И тут такое, значит, всеобщее ликование, все друг другу братья, все хорошо. И, наверное, часов до 9 примерно так обнимались и целовались.
On May the 7th, the Germans signed the unconditional surrender. Before May the 7th, all of Germany's Axis partners but one had already changed sides. Hungary, Romania, Italy were fighting with the Allies by the time Berlin fell. Only Japan remained to oppose the United Nations. Churchill and Roosevelt's successor, Harry Truman, were ready to declare May the 7th victory in Europe, VE Day. But their Soviet allies were not. They insisted on a separate surrender ceremony in Moscow, so VE Day became May the 8th. The war in the West was over. The prisoners of war were liberated.
We're in this camp, and suddenly a tank appeared. Next thing I know is the tank turned round and went down the far corner of the camp barrier, smashed the whole thing to the ground. The conning tower opened, and a fellow, a Brit, well, I think he was a Brit, stood up, waved to us. That was the end of the war for us.
The war in the West was over. Jewish people who had been hidden for years by brave countrymen could show their faces.
The day came when I was leaving, and Jan Rosier went to his little money box and took out 100 guilders for me, and he gave me 100 guilders. And he said to me, for the train or the bus or whatever you need, and don't forget to write. And so write I did all my life.
the war in the West was over. 160,000 collaborators were arrested, 1,000 were executed. Most of those who had served went home.
Marvellous feeling of joy, really. It had been a very long slog, so it wasn't a sort of tremendous celebration. We just sort of rather said, oh, thank God that's over. You know, that was rather the feeling.
The war in the East continued. A firebomb raid on Tokyo in March had killed 87,793 people and destroyed 38 square kilometers of the city. On April the 1st, American forces had landed on the largest of the Ryukyu Islands, an archipelago that stretches from Taiwan to the most southerly of the main home islands, Kyushu. They had landed on Okinawa.
We got ours May 1st. I was going on watch. I had a 4 o'clock watch in the morning to 8. And when you stand on watch, they come and call you because you can't get up. We don't have alarm clocks, you know what I mean? But you better make that watch or you're in big trouble.
For the invasion of Okinawa, 430 assault transports were loaded at 11 ports from Seattle to Leyte. On April 1st, 1,300 ships were massed offshore, and the 50,000 men of General Simon Bolivar Buckner's 10th Army went ashore against very little opposition. General Ushijima, commanding the Japanese 32nd Army, having concentrated his force south of the Shuri Line.
Just minutes after 4 o'clock. It hit the superstructure. Everything went blank. We were aft, we were machinery aft. Machinery forward was still good.
Over the next few days, the Japanese launched kamikaze assaults on the invasion fleet, which did not wholly relent in all the weeks of fighting that lay ahead. By the end of the Okinawa campaign, the suicides of 1,465 kamikaze pilots had accounted for 29 ships sunk, 120 damaged, and 3,048 sailors killed.
It was a kamikaze that took us out. We found his body with a parachute. Couldn't understand why he had a parachute on. Because he might have been shot down and he could bail out. What's the answer to that? I would tell you this, and this is hard for me to tell you. He did his job and he did it well. I fired on planes. I don't know if I evaded a plane because the sky lit up with shells. They do go down, but who did it? You don't know. In time, as I got older, I realized he didn't mean it. He did a job.
On the 9th of April, American invasion forces opened their main offensive against the well-planned fortifications of the Shuri Line. It was terrible fighting and slow progress. Okinawa north of the line was cleared with little real opposition. The Motobu Peninsula had been cleared by April 20th. But it was deep into May before Japanese resistance was broken in the south. The capital Naha fell on the 27th, and Shuri Castle, key to the defensive line, on the 29th. On June the 18th, with the battle almost won, General Buckner was killed by the effects of a shell exploding overhead. He was the highest-ranking American to be killed in action. To the surprise of the Americans, who had not known it elsewhere in the Pacific, the Japanese began to surrender as their morale collapsed. On June 22nd, General Ushijima committed suicide. Casualty lists were catastrophic. Japanese casualties exceeded 110,000. America's 40,000 in battle and nearly 10,000 more to kamikaze.
This is just part of the price being paid for victory in the Pacific.
It hurts you as you get older. Your memory is not pleasant. I don't blame anybody, but people don't know your program. I have to excuse myself because I'm usually a jolly fellow, a fairly wise guy.
The Okinawa casualties formed the basis for American projections of casualty rates for the invasion of Japan. The estimate was that taking Kyushu, the first of the home islands, would cause 268,000 American casualties, double the total battlefield deaths suffered by America in the war to date. That figure weighed heavily in the debate that would resolve the next phase of the war, the use of a new weapon. The leaders of the Grand Alliance met at Potsdam, but not the familiar faces. Harry S. Truman was now President of the United States, and by the time the conference adjourned in July, Winston Churchill would be missing from the lineup. The 1945 election, Winston Churchill and his party would be dumped in a landslide.
Mr. Attlee summed up for Movietone the situation as it appeared to a man about to be Prime Minister.
The Labour Party's great victory shows that the country is ready for a new policy to face new world conditions.
The agreement that was reached at Potsdam was the last between the members of the Grand Coalition. Shared out influence in Europe. The consequences were famously described less than a year later by Winston Churchill. An iron curtain has descended across the continent, he said. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. And he might have added, the cities of Ukraine, Belarus, and the Baltic states, for these had not always been part of the Russian Empire. At Potsdam, the leaders faced the opportunity to create a peace based on compassion and cooperation. Instead, they replaced World War with Cold War. Their priority was the Soviet Union's agreement to enter the war against Japan. Price they were prepared to pay was the temporary occupation of the countries of Eastern Europe, which continued until 1990. Potsdam issued a demand for Japan to surrender, which said, "The alternative for Japan is prompt and utter destruction." Words composed in the knowledge that on the 16th of July, the first atomic bomb had been successfully detonated at Alamogordo in New Mexico. Among scientists working on the project were 8 refugees from Nazi persecution. When When leading scientist Robert J. Oppenheimer saw the blast, he recalled a verse from a Hindu sacred book. If the light of 1,000 suns were to rise in the sky at once. The decision whether to use the new superbomb rested with the Commander-in-Chief, Harry S. Truman.
毎日学校行ったんですよ。月月火水木金金といってね、土曜も日曜もない。戦地の兵隊さんは土曜も日曜もないんだから君らも土曜日曜なんかありませんって毎日学校行ったんですよ。だから8時20分から朝礼が始まるから教室で待ってたんですよね。そしたら8時15分に来たんだけどね、飛行機がね、家の中にいるから分かんないわね。
Truman ordered that the first special bomb be dropped as soon as conditions allowed in early August. So, on August the 6th, the B-29 Enola Gay dropped Little Boy from 9,600 meters. It detonated 575 meters above the city, generating a blast of 300,000 degrees Celsius for 1/10,000th of a second.
ここはね、パーッと青白くね、真っ白に光ったんですよ。ピカーッとね。
It was not designed to blow a city up, but to knock it down.
からね、ドーンという大音響がして爆風が来てガラガラガラガラガラと校舎がめちゃめちゃに壊れたの。それでその下敷きになったんですよ。だから土でこれでもかこれでもかってね、ガンガンガンガンこう全身を打ちのめされたような感じがしたね。助けてくれしいなというふうに思ったけどね、気を失ってしまいました。だからほとんどの友達がみんな死んだわけね。殺人構成に当たったりめちゃめちゃに壊れた校舎の下敷きになってね。だから私はね、奇跡的に死ななかったんですよ。しばらく経ったらね、はーっと気がついたの。真っ暗闇の中にいたですよ。真夏な強烈な太陽がガンガンガンガン照ってたのにね、全子が倒れたからね、真っ暗闇になったんですよ。そしたらまだね、生き残った友達がいたと見えてね、瓦礫の中でね、お父さんお母さん痛いよ助けてって叫び声や泣き声が聞こえてくるね。2クラスあって60人60人だから2クラスあって4、5人ぐらい出てきたのかな。
100,000 were killed, up to 100,000 more doomed. It was, said Harry Truman, the greatest thing in history. Though no one really knew whether it would shorten the war.
もうね、家の近くまで行ったらね、また日が迫ってきました。あーとぼやぼやしちゃったら焼け死ぬからね、火に飲まれてね。それでね、その川にね、鶴見橋という木の橋だからね、爆風でね落ちたよ、川の中に橋が落ちてたよ。で泳いで渡ったのだからだとね。そしたらね、いっぱい人が流れてきだしたん、上流からみんな川へ飛び込んだりするから暑いしね、やけどしてるし。川がね、みんな阿鼻叫喚の地獄の川になったんですよ。いっぱいいっぱい。そこらの川もみんなそうなったんですよ。いっぱいいっぱい人がみんな飛び込んで、ひどいやけどしたりしてね、飛び込んでるから。助けてくれーって言ったってどうしようもないわね。
Despite Hiroshima, there was no response from Japan to the Potsdam Declaration, so Truman ordered the second attack.
That's the atomic bomb exploding at Nagasaki. The film was taken in a B-29 many miles away.
Fat Boy was detonated over Nagasaki. 35,000 were killed according to the Americans, 74,800 according to authorities in Nagasaki. On the day that Nagasaki was bombed, the Trans-Baikal and Second Far East fronts of the Red Army invaded Manchuria. The First Far East Front moved from Vladivostok.
8月9日の朝ですよ。地平線のこの果てからね、むくむくとしたようなのが上がってきてさ、ぐーっと。そしてパッパッと火を吹くとね、こっちのうちは吹っ飛んじゃうんだ。砲撃されるの、戦車に。戦車がギューッと上がって大砲がパッとこのぐらい上がるとね、パッと火を吹くんですよ。だからその日の朝は8月9日の朝は190人でうちはいたんですよ、仲間が。それがお昼には50名近くなっちゃったの。みんな戦死しちゃって。もう少し安定した人間らしい生活をしようということは思うね。はじめ銃をこっちに置けと、剣はここに置けと、で爆弾手榴弾とかもここに置けてみんな指示してね、そこ行ってみんな置いてくるんですよ。そうすると今度は囲い出すとこ入れられてね、これが収容所だ、捕虜。
During the campaign in Manchuria, the Soviet Union took 674,000 Japanese prisoners. Half survived their captivity. Of the Japanese who had settled in Manchuria, they had been promised fresh virgin plains ready to welcome armies of fresh migrants. 67,000 starved to death and 11,000 died at the hands of vengeful Chinese. When the Supreme Council for the Conduct of the War met in Tokyo on the 9th of August, there was bitter conflict between those arguing for peace and the war party. It was the Soviet invasion, rather than Hiroshima, which forced the issue. On the 10th, the day after the Soviet invasion, the Japanese sent a Morse code signal to the effect that they accepted the Potsdam demands, subject only to there being nothing which would compromise the role and sovereignty of the emperor. On the 11th, Japan received the Allied reply. On the 14th of August, the emperor ordered acceptance of the terms and recorded the message that was broadcast to his people the next day. They had never heard his voice. Now they heard Hirohito speak. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage, he told them. Therefore, our empire accepts the provisions of their joint declaration. Hirohito did not say what the joint declaration was, so when he had finished speaking, a popular announcer came on air to explain that it meant that the war was over. People went home and waited. When polled after the war, only 4% of Japanese believed that they would be humanely treated. The others believed what they had been told, that all they could expect was starvation, torture, and death. Shortly after dawn on August the 28th, 45 US C-47 transports touched down at Tsugi Air Base. US Colonel Charles Tench stepped onto the tarmac. He was the first conqueror ever to set foot on Japanese soil.
終戦後アメリカの兵隊さんなんかチョコレートとかなんかトラックの上からバーッと巻いてるやつもう小軸みたいにみんな拾っとって。これ雲がない時アメリカの上からトラックの上からあーっとばらまかれたらそれはまあ小軸みたいに這い回って食べましたわな。
On the deck of the USS Missouri 6 years and 1 day after Hitler had launched his invasion of Poland, General MacArthur called forward General Wainwright, who had surrendered his command in the Philippines, and General Percival, who had surrendered his command in Singapore. They stood at his shoulder as he accepted Imperial Japan's unconditional surrender. The war in the East was over. After 8 years of fighting, the Japanese released all of their Chinese prisoners of war. All 56 of them. And the Allied prisoners of war who had survived were liberated.
4 corvettes of the Australian Navy entered Damwon Harbour. I can still see them coming down that bay to recover us. By this time, there was only 101 of us left. I forget just where I would have been, but it was on this ship anyway, coming home. We heard Bing Crosby singing, "Don't Fence Me In." I kid you not.
Oh, give me land, lots of land, under starry skies above. Don't fence me in.
Those who had fought could go home.
The wide open country that I love. Don't fence me in.
そして親父がね、よく帰ってあってて玄関で俺を褒めてるだよ。父さん、母さんどうしたやって。俺夢には一回悪かったことがあるの。母さんの死んだ時、シベリアから帰るシベリアにいた時、9月の9日にね、おふくろのつって夢見が悪いことあったんで日は合わせねえけど。だから俺の母さんもあったら親父は下向いて風のように聞こえねえな声で何とか言ってたわ。何亡くなったのかって聞いたらそうだって。いやーこれは悲しかったな。涙が止めど流れてね。それじゃあ俺お墓行ってくるわと。ちょっと線香と花用意してくれって言って妹に線香と花持たしてさ。
Return of peace after the world's most devastating war. VJ Day. Victory in the second half of the global conflict.
I get off the trolley car with my big duffel bag on my back and my army uniform. I'd been away for 2 years, and here is my sister with her newborn baby and my little mutt alongside of her. Pulls away from me, comes running up the block, and my sister is screaming, "I'm sorry, sir. I'm sorry. She's never done that. My dog is a good dog." And the dog is running, and he's all over me, and I'm crying in tears. And she didn't know me till she got within like 5 feet. My little dog knew me. Came home and lived happily ever after.
The greatest man-made event in history was a war of such colossal proportion that the cost in money is hard to comprehend. The tally in human life even more difficult. For every 2 people that the United States lost in the war, Britain, her Commonwealth and Empire lost 3. The Japanese, 12. The Germans, 22. The Soviet Union, 184. The aggregate figure of 27 million dead for the Soviet Union is probably the best guess. And for China, more than 20 million. No one can accurately calculate the final death toll, but it is surely dwarfed by the total of lives not lost, but permanently affected by a war which can never be understood in statistics.
I don't speak for the army or what I was involved with. I just gave you the general outlook of how we progressed. But the individual fighting with bayonets, hand grenades, that is war. That is war.
For so long, a display of colours defining this or that nation's sovereignty over others, the map of the world has now become a great patchwork. The vast land empires are no more. The great maritime empires, Spain, Portugal, France, the Netherlands, the British, all gone. But why? Empires are acquired, conquered for trade, resources, territory, and because of a conceit common to all empire builders. That because their cultural and political DNA is superior, they are right to inseminate other societies. This has been the story of such a conceit. Two imperial dreams drove their people into the Second World War. The Japanese and German empires expanded violently. They collapsed, bankrupt. And their collapse sounded the death knell of the old imperial system. The price of empire can be expressed in monetary terms, but the price also involves values which have nothing to do with money. The enormous convulsion of the Second World War, infected as it was in every part by the bacillus of racism, allowed people to see that independence and identity are incorruptible values. Plunder, to slaughter, to steal, these things they misname empire. Wrote the Roman historian Tacitus 2,000 years ago. Those who could have been embraced as liberators were loathed as conquerors. They misnamed their conquests empire, and they paid the price.